There is a strange kind of quiet that settles over a war when the fighting stops being the main event. It is not the silence of peace, but rather a heavy, brooding stillness that signals a deeper, shifting undercurrent in the geopolitical landscape. In recent days, the loudest noise coming out of Eastern Europe did not stem from the roar of artillery or the hum of a loitering drone. Instead, it was the rustle of a routine parcel. In a government office in Kyiv, someone carefully wrapped a medal in a box, handed it to a courier, and dispatched it toward Warsaw. This was no ordinary token. It was the Order of the White Eagle, Poland's oldest and highest honor. The man mailing it back was Volodymyr Zelenskyy, and he took this drastic step only after the Polish president moved to formally strip him of the distinction. We need to sit with this image for a moment, because this single act of diplomatic defiance reveals far more about where this conflict is heading than any shifting front line on a military map. In any grand geopolitical struggle, a nation can endure the loss of territory. Its cities can be reduced to rubble, but as long as its alliances hold fast, the will to fight endures. What is far more difficult to survive is the erosion of the narrative a country tells about itself, the story its allies must believe in to sustain their support. When the foundational myths of that relationship begin to crack, even the deepest bonds of solidarity begin to fray, and that is precisely the fracture opening up between Warsaw and Kyiv right now. To understand the sudden bitterness of this rift, we must look backward, turning to the pages of history where the blood has never truly dried. Late last May, Zelenskyy signed a state decree granting an elite Ukrainian Special Forces unit a new honorary title, the Heroes of the Ukrainian Insurgent Army. If you are not deeply immersed in the complex, blood-soaked history of Eastern Europe, that name might sound like a standard bureaucratic designation buried in military archives, but if you are Polish, if your family roots lie in that soil, that name feels like a fresh ember dropped onto an open wound. The Ukrainian Insurgent Army, known historically as the UPA, is the nationalist organization responsible for the systematic, brutal slaughter of Polish civilians in the Volhynia region between 1943 and 1944. This was not a series of standard military skirmishes. Entire villages, humming with life, were wiped out as women, children, and the elderly fell victim to a campaign of ethnic cleansing. Polish historians formally and legally classify this dark chapter as a genocide. Estimates of the death toll range anywhere from 50,000 to well over 100,000 people. The ambiguity in that number does not stem from a lack of historical evidence, but from the horrifying reality that entire communities were erased so thoroughly that no one was left alive to count the bodies or remember the names of the dead. On the other side of the border, Ukraine's perspective on this history is far more complex and layered, a nuance that the outside world often overlooks or dismisses. Kyiv's official stance, shared by the majority of Ukrainian historians, is that they do not celebrate the UPA for the massacres or the innocent blood spilled in Volhynia. Instead, they revere the organization for its fierce, decades-long resistance against Soviet occupation and communist domination. Stepan Bandera, the movement's most famous and polarizing figure, is viewed in modern Ukraine as a national icon of sovereignty. He is championed precisely because he stood against Moscow's imperial ambitions. In the Ukrainian collective imagination, his legacy of national liberation is entirely compartmentalized from the horrific ethnic violence his followers unleashed upon Polish populations. Whether it is intellectually or morally honest to separate a leader's resistance from the atrocities committed in his name is the exact debate that Poles and Ukrainians have been waging for 80 years. This historical argument has not grown any easier simply because both nations now find themselves standing shoulder to shoulder against a common existential threat. When an enemy knocks at the gate, old wounds do not vanish. Sometimes, under the pressure of survival, they throb even harder. The volatile timing of this decree acted as accelerant on an already smoldering fire, catching diplomats on both sides off guard. The announcement landed just weeks before July 11th, the solemn day Poland observes as its National Day of Remembrance for the victims of the Volhynia Massacres. Therefore, when Polish President Nawrowski, who happens to be a trained professional historian himself, responded by revoking Zelenskyy's highest honor, he was not manufacturing a political grievance out of thin air. He was reacting instinctively to a sudden blow dealt to a historical trauma at a highly sensitive moment. True to the nature of such disputes, the situation escalated with dramatic speed. Three former Ukrainian presidents, Leonid Kuchma, Viktor Yushchenko, and Petro Poroshenko, sent back their own Polish state decorations in a coordinated display of solidarity with Zelenskyy. In retaliation, Polish politicians began returning the honors and medals they had received from Ukraine over the years. Rather than attempting to lower the diplomatic temperature, Zelenskyy fueled the fire, remarks circulating that a title on a document is merely a collection of words, not a reflection of core policy or intent. For the Polish public and government, this stance felt deeply dismissive at a moment when they desperately needed statesmanship and historical sensitivity. The rift widened to the point that Zelenskyy skipped a major Ukraine recovery conference hosted on Polish soil, signaling a profound breakdown in communication. Poland's Institute of National Remembrance quickly launched a widespread public information campaign detailing the historical crimes of Ukrainian nationalists, while marches wound through the streets of Warsaw with crowds chanting that they would never allow the ideology of Bandera to be rehabilitated. Looking at this unraveling spectacle, one might easily mistake it for a pedantic argument about the ghost of the past. But in truth, this is not a debate about history. It is modern domestic politics wearing the costume of history. Poland has been, without competition, the most steadfast and vital lifeline for Ukraine's war effort in Europe. They opened their borders to millions of refugees, depleted their own military reserves to supply hardware, risked their own strategic buffers, and expended immense political capital at every international summit. Yet beneath this wall of solidarity, public opinion polls reveal a shifting reality that many Western commentators have been slow to recognize. Favorable Polish views toward Ukrainians have experienced a staggering 40-point drop over the past few years. Today, a near majority of the Polish public harbors negative sentiments, and nearly 80% believe that Ukraine has failed to adequately acknowledge or apologize for the Volhynia genocide. The 1.7 million Ukrainian refugees currently living in Poland have found themselves, through no fault of their own, becoming political hostages to a souring public mood. What we are witnessing is the emergence of deep wartime fatigue, a natural exhaustion that settles into any host society during a prolonged conflict. The average Polish citizen is beginning to ask, quietly at first and now with increasing volume, what their nation is receiving in return for the immense economic and strategic price it is paying. For a conservative leadership facing upcoming elections, the incentive to give voice to this growing domestic resentment, rather than suppress it, is overwhelming. It is no coincidence that Nawrowski's approval ratings surged after he rescinded Zelenskyy's medal. It is simply how democratic politics functions when a leader mirrors a shifting public tide. The tangible fallout of this political shift is that Polish lawmakers are now actively demanding that Ukraine's future accession to the European Union be explicitly conditioned upon a resolution of the Volhynia dispute. They are demanding the exhumation and proper burial of historical victims, along with an official, institutional apology from Kyiv as a prerequisite for further European integration. While the European Commission has offered to mediate the dispute, and both foreign ministers have met recently to de-escalate the rhetoric, the underlying reality remains unchanged. Ukraine's most critical wartime patron is exhausted, and its public no longer automatically equates the defense of Ukraine with the immediate defense of Poland. When we introduce Russia into this calculus, the strategic picture becomes painfully clear. Moscow is watching this fracture widen with immense satisfaction, particularly because it costs the Kremlin absolutely nothing. Russian state media has a long-standing tradition of amplifying the slightest crack in Western unity, holding it up as proof that an alliance built on shaky ground cannot withstand a war of attrition. In this instance, Russian propagandists do not even need to manufacture a narrative. The hostility between Warsaw and Kyiv is authentic, rooted in genuine trauma and inflamed by real political incentives. Russia's only task is to keep the wound open, ensuring the conversation remains centered on historical grievances while the brutal war of attrition grinds on in the background. The devastating missile strikes that hit Kyiv in recent weeks offer a stark reminder that historical disputes do not slow the tempo of modern warfare. In a single night, dozens of civilians are killed, residential blocks are turned to rubble, and when Ukraine runs out of interceptor missiles to counter incoming ballistic waves, Zelensky's pleas grow increasingly desperate, demanding that allies look past the graveyards of the 20th century and provide the air defenses needed to save lives today. Yet, in analyzing this volatile theater, we must exercise caution and avoid the temptation of presenting speculation as verified fact. Rumors frequently circulate through intelligence corridors suggesting that Russia is preparing a direct, kinetic provocation against a NATO member, specifically Poland, to test the collective defense mechanisms of the alliance. These claims are often tied to leaked Western intelligence assessments and are taken seriously by analysts who watch figures like Dmitry Medvedev issue warnings about shifting nuclear postures following Finland's integration into NATO's nuclear planning. However, a wide gap exists between an analyst's worst-case scenario and an actual imminent military offensive, and when discussing nuclear escalation, maintaining analytical sobriety is paramount. The focus must remain on what can be visibly observed: a Russian state that has spent years probing the vulnerabilities of NATO cohesion, and a Polish state that is rapidly modernizing its military for the possibility of a wider European conflict, even as a segment of its own public doubts the immediacy of the threat. Ultimately, the bitter truth is that nobody within this triangle benefits from a prolonged rupture between Poland and Ukraine, save for the third player who is not even in the room. Warsaw requires a stable, independent, and secure Ukraine to act as a permanent strategic buffer against Russian expansionism. Kyiv, conversely, cannot afford to alienate its most critical European logistics hub over a dispute regarding the nomenclature of a military brigade. But history rarely moves along a rational or convenient path. It changes only when living leaders decide that the gathering storm on the horizon poses a far greater danger than the unhealed wounds of 3 generations ago. Whether the leadership in Warsaw and Kyiv can internalize this reality before the strategic damage becomes irreversible remains the defining question hanging over the region, far more than any diplomatic communique or technical delivery of arms. If they fail to find common ground, history will not hesitate to punish them using the very ghosts they refuse to lay to rest.